Hello, I'm Lindsay Johnson, Fiscal Sponsorship and Communications Manager at Southeast Uplift. Thank you for joining us today. This is our second session in the 7-part House of Development webinar series presented by and in partnership with COGEO. This session is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. You are welcome to have your camera on or off, whatever is most comfortable for you. We have enabled captions. If you have additional access needs, feel free to post those in the chat. We ask that you please remain muted during the presentation and save questions for the end. We have reserved time for a brief Q&A. Our third session will be next Tuesday, June 27th from 4 to 5 p.m. and that will be focused on fundraising events. Now I'm going to hand the mic over to our presenter, Chelsi, to introduce herself. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Great introduction. And yeah, so for some context on who I am and who COGEO is and what we do. So my name is Chelsi Straubinger, and I am Director of Client Services with COGEO. And we are a consulting agency for 501c3s and the 501c3 sector. And we provide both advice and support services for various 501c3s across the US, really. We support mainly small to medium organizations. That's really our sweet spot where we can have the most impact. We really want to look at catalyzing growth and really supporting fundraising and development needs for our clients and various organizations in the sector. So between all of us with COGEO, we have about 40 years of fundraising experience working with organizations, again, throughout the United States. We've partnered with various organizations raising hundreds of millions of dollars, across various sectors. So have a lot of experience, and hopefully this webinar session and series will give you a lot of background and support for really building your networks and catalyzing your growth as well. All right. So with that, I'm going to just dive right into our presentation. Okay, starting off with today's webinar. Again, as Lindsay mentioned, we are in a second session of our 7-part House of Development webinar series. And we're focusing today on, just on my video real quick, just so I don't get too laggy. Sometimes my computer doesn't like Zoom very much, but yeah, we are in what we call the House of Development, which I'll dive into in a little bit more detail in a little bit here. Cornerstone 1, annual membership and annual giving, which I will show here. There. So this gives you a visual of the House of Development. And we've talked about this in our previous session. So if you want to check that webinar out, you can. The recording will be posted on Southeast Uplift's YouTube channel. But for a little context and background, just so you understand going into this series here, the House of Development is a tool that we have developed to explain the successful building blocks for a 501c3 and demonstrate visually how development is so crucial in achieving fundraising goals and how different elements of fundraising build on each other. So the House of Development is really intended to be looked at from the bottom up. So you'll see the bottom layer here is the pathway or the garden, which is communications, which we discussed in our previous webinar. And that's things like public relations, websites, social media, e-newsletters, and annual reports. And now we're diving into, moving into the house, the first room here, the annual and membership giving. All right. So if you want to learn more about the House of Development, feel free to reach out to me, email cs@cogeo.us, or check out our websites at cogeo.us or goraise.us. But for now, let's focus on annual and membership giving. So first, goals and context for the day. So with our session today, hopefully you'll be left with an understanding of why annual and membership giving is the first cornerstone, first room of the House of Development and so critical to your fundraising work. Understanding the true value of annual and membership giving within the lifetime experience of a given donor. And you'll also begin to understand the vital role of data and how clean and organized data and systems really fuel the rest of the smart home, which is really just our phrase to define the house of development, plus things like data management platforms like Salesforce, for instance, and different tracking methods to really make sure that you are tracking your data. Right. So what is an annual and membership giving program? Essentially, it's retail. It's unrestricted dollars. So first, to distinguish it from a major gift, which at COGEO we define as 1/1000th of the organization's annual budget. So for instance, if an organization's annual budget is $500,000, a major gift is going to be $500. If the budget is 1 million, a major gift is going to be 1,000. Right. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to segment donors who are in the major gift range in one of our following sessions. Key is really not sending them an annual appeal, mass appealing. You'll want to really send targeted messaging to them. But we'll dive into that in a little more detail in following sessions. So the group we're talking about for the purposes of this presentation is about 90% of your donor population. So they're the people making smaller gifts year to year, hopefully, below the 500 range typically. And these are donors gained through mass appeal and push-pull tactics, which is really just code speak for pushing out an email and pulling people back into your website to consider a transaction or to learn more about your organization. And best practices here include targeted stewardship and appeals to an intentionally segmented prospect and donor database periodically throughout the year. So it's really important to keep this donor base, your smaller donors, informed, even if they are, smaller retail donors. You want to keep in touch with them. And one thing I want to flag, this isn't moves management, which is a term used to describe stewardship in interaction with major donors. Again, it's just the 90% that I talked about who need information. So when they get an appeal from you at the end of year, for instance, or other times throughout the year, they'll consider giving again or for the first time. They'll have the context to make that gift. All right. Next slide here. How is annual and membership giving presented and implemented? So the most common tactics that we see typically are first time-based subscriptions. So those are recurring donations. So for instance, someone giving $50 to a favorite 501c3 each month. We also see event-thons, marathons, for instance. And this can be used in lieu of or in conjunction with appeals. So it's really an annual giving initiative, and it resembles or is an event really to raise funds and to get people interested and motivated. We also see crowdfunding. This is really particularly project-based. So if there's a certain project or area that needs specific funding, crowdfunding is great for that. And this can also be done in parallel to appeals or thons. Just needs to again be targeted for a specific project or region area, kind of depending on what your organization does. And another tactic is relating it to a signature event. So you can do an appeal in relation to a signature event, which we'll talk a lot about in more detail in a future session. We'll talk about events, how to really host a really solid one, good best practices. But for now, signature event is, for instance, one event held in the year that really sets you apart from your peers. So during those events, you really have everyone's attention, and you can really promote your annual giving or membership program. And last up here is year-end appeals, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So these are one of the most popular end of year. Season usually starts mid-October through December. And a lot of giving occurs in this time. We'll talk about some stats in a little bit to show the impact of year-end giving. But for now, really want to flag that for you as a key to annual and membership giving. And one thing too, I want to note before we move on, some of our clients use Giving Tuesday kind of as a launch pad for end of year appeal. But I do want to say, don't use Giving Tuesday. Not recommended that you use Giving Tuesday as your sole source. You really just want to weave it into your year-end appeal. Apologies. A little trouble here getting back to the tab. There we go. I'm sorry, having a little bit of technical difficulties. The link keeps opening and there we go. All right, so why is annual and membership giving important? Or in other words, why is annual giving a cornerstone room of the House of Development? So it's really the foundation along with events, which we'll again talk about in our next session. It can help alleviate operating needs because the dollars received are incremental and they also go straight to operations, which is always ideal. And one question that we get asked frequently is if you should have a budget for annual giving. And if you're a startup or haven't implemented an annual giving program yet, the answer would be no. So in year one, we typically recommend you go out and raise as much as you can. And then in year two, you'll have a benchmark to really measure progress. And by year two, you'll have a goal with the aim of increasing it every year at whatever rate you can, or at least maintaining that year two level. Right. So to circle back to the content on this slide, some key reasons that annual and membership giving are important. First, it creates public awareness of your organization and its mission. It also creates pipeline tactics to attract new and incremental donors. There's also strong stewardship opportunities for current donors that are kind of weaved into annual giving. You're also able to engage new and incremental volunteers. You're also raising incremental funds, as I mentioned, which is really ideal, steady source of income for your 501c3 or agency. It also gives you the opportunity to present a new or different image. So for instance, you can communicate any updates or changes in the end of your appeal, for instance. So it's a great way to keep in touch with your membership while also tying in that fundraising element. It also provides internal community building opportunities among the staff and board. There's also external community building and partnership opportunities through annual giving. It's also a way to advance marketing and PR initiatives, which we discussed in our previous webinar. So through annual giving, you're really marketing, you're telling stories and communicating the work that you're doing in the greater community and your impact. Annual giving also provides you an opportunity to honor, thank, and recognize your staff and community. And it's also key here, last couple of points. It's the first step in moving donors up in the House of Development. And that's a really important one. So you can really think of it as an entry point. And from there, you can move them along to a potential major gift. And most importantly, it gives you the opportunity to gather data intelligence, which then allows you to analyze their full giving potential, which we'll talk a little bit more in a following slide. All right. So what can be challenging about annual and membership giving? So as I'm sure many of you are aware, fundraising isn't easy. It can be really tactical and there can be challenges. And here's a few key challenges that we've identified in our work with various agencies. The first is standing out in the crowd. So the sector wasn't nearly as robust about 30 years ago as it is today. The competition's really grown and it can be a challenge to make sure your messaging is standing out in the crowd of a lot of other agencies doing really good work. And another challenge is the people power that's required to execute consistently. You really need people to execute on stewardship and engagement, which can be a challenge. You need to make sure you find the right people and people who can really be dedicated in their time to the work. See, there's also large data populations and sets to manage. And this is really important because, again, having good data is a really essential piece to the cornerstone for the House of Development and really all elements of the House. You really need to be making sure that you are tracking all your outreach activities, any donors, and make sure that you are stewarding them appropriately. Another piece of this too is that communication has shifted from, just having their address and phone number to, email and different social media platforms and figuring out what your donor and how your donor wants to be communicated with. So it can be a lot to track and balance, and you want to make sure that you have a system that is able to manage that and track larger data sets. You also need compelling storytelling, which can also be another challenge. Just kind of figuring out how best to tell your story and the impact you have in the community. But in our experience, the best storytelling is always telling the truth. That's really what donors need to hear, and just really hear the impact that you're having and real examples when you can provide them. All right, and on to our next slide here. This is actually a repeat slide from our previous webinar that I want to reiterate just because of its importance. So annual and membership giving is really driven by individual donors, which is significant. So there can be a tendency among many agencies to really hyper-focus on larger funders like corporations and foundations. But as you can see, individuals compose the majority of contributions. And if you don't have an annual membership or giving program, you're really missing out on a major opportunity here. So for instance, in this data set, this was gathered in 2021, 2022, about 67% of individuals really drove development dollars, which is massive. And I will say this number is a little bit skewed just because it incorporates religious agencies, which is a big one for individual donors, but even accounting for that, it's still a really significant number and money that you don't want to be leaving on the table. All right. So with that, let's dive into a hypothetical here that we've developed based on our past experiences and, a kind of a conglomeration of previous clients and agencies we've had contact with. All right. So this really helps us put together the information I've already talked about and show the impact of annual giving. So here's an organization that started as a very small agency, timeline of, let's say, about 1977, 1978 to present day. It started with no employees. It was fully volunteer driven. And in year one, it raised $234 just through annual giving. And by year 40, about 2 generations later, let's assume they have a robust agency, they have a development staff, they're doing major and planned gifts. Now they're raising $220,000 year to year. And this is also assuming they haven't done a capital campaign, or that number would be significantly larger. So again, this is a hypothetical, but it's really typical organization and a pattern that we've seen in the industry in the past. And the main point that I want to highlight underlying this is that in order to achieve this result, the focus really has to be on existing donors and stewarding them, and thereby connecting to new donors through your existing donors. So you're creating a network with your current donors. You don't want to just be throwing spaghetti at the wall. You want to triangulate as much as possible through your current donors, current volunteers, anyone in your network. And another point too to highlight here is, again, data management. So if someone, say, gives you a gift this year, you want to think of them as someone who can give you a gift for the next 40 years and steward that accordingly. And again, you want to think about annual giving really in terms of think about it as a funnel that can help you capture the first transaction and then build the relationship to capture this longer term engagement that could expand down the road. All right. Now on to a case study that is similar to our, little mini hypothetical there. So this is Phil Knight and Stanford. So for a little background, Rob Kussel, who is COGEO's Managing Director of Consulting, was at Stanford on the board of directors in the early 2000s. And he was, major piece in a lot of their fundraising work. So has some real experience with the organization. And Phil Knight, as many of you I'm sure know, founder of Nike, was an undergrad and a graduate student at the School of Business. He started Nike in the 70s, and he wanted University of Oregon and Stanford University to try out his shoes, which were his prototypes at the time. So he donated them to both programs and they loved them. He tweaked them actually based on their input, and now Nike is what it is today. So about 20 years later, he was able to give a transformational gift of $400 million over a number of years, which in the end created the Knight Hennessy Scholars Program. And again, the story really highlights the importance of acknowledging even the smallest of gifts. In this case, it was prototype track shoes, but they stewarded it and accepted it and were gracious and led to this really massive, again, transformational gift. So again, you want to steward even the smallest of gifts because you don't know what it could lead to. All right. So here is actually 2 slides. This one is broken out a little bit. It's kind of a screenshot of a spreadsheet. I'll skip to the next slide here to give you a little bit of an idea. I wanted to make it large so we could see it a little better. But I want to walk you through this a little bit. So this is a sample of a data intelligence spreadsheet. This is information gathered from one of COGEO's wealth screening partners, Windfall, and really shows why annual giving can be so important in capturing certain data and what that can lead to. So again, to my point earlier, getting an annual gift is great. What you want to do too is gather as much information on the person as possible. Really key is, first name, last name, address, email address, and phone number. So some basic contact information. And then, Windfall, there's different types of organizations that can do wealth screenings and run them. And it will give you this data back. So for instance, this first line here, this individual net worth of $321 million. So let's say they made a donation to an organization, $500. The organization captured their information, came back with this information, and it really helps in their cultivation of the individual and stewardship. It helps inform how you approach the person and next steps. It really takes a lot of the guesswork out of fundraising and stewardship. And again, you can gain a lot of this intelligence just by gathering their basic contact information. Right. So yeah, just to really briefly walk you through this spreadsheet here. Again, rows up to the phone number provided by the agency, rows onward from net worth were provided by Windfall. So they provide, for instance, their net worth and some various other data points that can be interesting to look at and understand their potential giving. So if they're recently divorced, if there was a recent death in the family, if they're a boat owner, which is an interesting one, but it just speaks a little bit to kind of who they are, what position they might have in the community. If they're a multi-property owner, if they're a philanthropic giver, political donor, their political party even, if they're a small business owner, if they have an association with a trust. Here is a list also of NTE codes. So NTE codes are codes designated by the IRS to capture a different 501c3s, different sectors in the 501c3. So for instance, N here is sports. And honestly, I don't have them all memorized. There's a lot of them, but IRS actually is really great because they have a nice guide on their website. So you can just fact check, do a search find. So for instance, we have a sports organization, and this is NTA codes list out the individual, their past giving to different sectors. So this individual has given to sports in the past, just helps us understand their giving patterns, and they might be more amenable to a larger ask. It also has regional focus if they've given it national, local, international levels. If they have an association with a foundation, or if they're a foundation officer or trustee. So again, just a lot of really great data to, again, take the guesswork out of some of this fundraising work that you're doing and understand your constituency a little bit better. All right. Now let's dive into a couple case studies. First is the Ice Bucket Challenge. So this one really illustrates the importance of cultivating donors to retain them. And this is another case study I mentioned in our previous webinar. And I do that intentionally because I really like to establish some known case studies to show that the different rooms of the house are connected and how they build on each other. So this one was a really successful initiative in gaining celebrities and individuals to do the Ice Bucket Challenge, as I'm sure many of you are aware, to raise money for research of Lou Gehrig's disease. And it really took off with social media, with the ability to self-broadcast, and a lot of news sources picked it up. So it was really massive. But they went wrong in one way, and one critical way. They never ramped up internally to manage the data to collect all the donor information that was coming in. So while the actual execution of the initiative was really phenomenal, they raised millions, the back end was non-existent, essentially, which is really unfortunate. So in this instance, again, really successful execution of the campaign, but lack of planning or follow-up in terms of stewardship to retain donors. So they weren't really able to convert the celebrities, for instance, into major or long-term donors because they just didn't have any data on them. So the moral is essentially the data really has to be good. You have to be aggressive in terms of gathering and maintaining it. And stewardship can be more important than the initial transaction itself. So it all points to kind of our internal saying at COGEO is that the work starts when the funds come in. You can't just call it a day once you get a donation. You really have to follow up on it and maintain it and think about it as stewarding long-term. All right. Now let's dive into another case study. This one is with Empower Me Academy, which is one of COGEO's current clients. They're a youth basketball organization based in San Francisco. And their mission, they're dedicated to developing student leaders through sports, specifically basketball. And they provide basketball training and mentorship to really focus on athletic excellence, but also the actual players themselves, their mental health, and really stewarding them to become strong young individuals, student leaders. And they're really impactful, have about 300 to 400 active students at any given time and doing really important work in the community. So they have a signature event that we'll actually talk about in a little more detail in our next webinar about events. But it was formerly Basketball-thon. They've recently just rebranded it to Empower Fest this year. So it's a really fun event. It's expanding a little bit from the initial thon elements, but initially it was classic basketball-thon. You'll see a lot of thon and fest type events with a lot of youth sports organizations because it's really fully mission-centric. So what it does, it involves players to play for a certain number of hours, and it places them on teams to compete. And before the event, the days leading up to it, the player will go out and raise funds from friends and families to collect a certain amount of money, which is then collected by the agency. And yeah, they can raise really significant amount of funds. And again, key is being mission-centric and making sure that you're tapping into your community for unrestricted funds. And we've launched a lot of these for our clients, youth soccer, basketball, different types of sports. And it's been really fun all around. Clients are really excited about it and they love it. But key here is making sure that you are really planning it well. So you're optimizing the event and your planning. So you're not just expending a lot of energy and not seeing much in return. But we'll dive into that again in a little more detail in our next webinar. But I wanted to talk about the events in terms of their stewardship of donors. So during their first year, EMA did something really important and something that we recommend all our clients do for many of their different types of events, which is holding some different awards for their community. So what they did first was they provided a community impact award, and this recognized one of their key major donors, which was really kind of a great way to steward that major gift. So that's a little bit of a look ahead again, but they also had some smaller awards for just families and players. So this is an example of a fundraising event that was really aimed to steward annual giving and involve the community and expand their community, because the players invited their friends and families who really kind of expanded the event from there. And it's involving people who weren't initially members of EMA to learn more about the organization and what they're doing. All right. Now, on to our next slide, where we have some stats on annual gifts that are typically made. So first box here, you'll see 10% of all giving happens in the first 30 days of the year, in the last 30 days of the year. So that is significant. And that is a big reason why we always advocate doing a year-end appeal for all our clients. It can be really important and speaks to that next box there, which is on average, 501c3s raise 17 to 22% of annual revenue in December. So you want to really utilize those last couple months of the year and the mood that people are in. They're going to be a little more giving and charitable, and you want to leverage that as much as possible. And next to the right, you'll see the average online donation was $128 in 2022. And below that, you'll note that the average annual donation for recurring donors is nearly triple, 326. So it really speaks to the power of stewardship and communication for current donors to just increase their gifts. I'll also note that some gifts might come in early January, which can be credited to the donor when it is postmarked in the case of offline donations. So sometimes you'll see some donations trickle in early in the following year from December, November. All right. Now jumping into best practices for annual and membership giving programs. And before I dive into this slide, just for some context, there's been a pretty big paradigm shift over the last 25 years. So we were moving away from, snail mail, membership drives, things like that, to more involved, sophisticated set of push-pull strategies to leverage social media, email, different types of platforms. And the work is a lot more tactical now. Before, it was usually just one appeal that went out to everyone in your network, and that wasn't typically segmented in terms of content. So now it requires a lot more tactical decision-making and work to manage the data. Again, going back to data management, which I know is a recurring theme throughout really all of our presentations here. So here are 5 key bullets for best practices in terms of membership giving programs. So first, you really need a sound plan. So you need to strategically roll out your plan. And at a minimum, you need to determine a few things. So first is the appeal frequency. So think about what's your push-pull, what's your membership drive, what's your snail mail if you do that. So really anything that you're utilizing, how often are you doing it? Is it 1 appeal a year, 2 a year? Really depends on your preferences, what you think that your community expects. So at a minimum, we recommend doing that year-end appeal, speaking to our previous slide of how impactful last few days of the year can be. Some of our clients also do spring appeals that you don't usually raise quite as much, but see a little bit of a trickle in, and it's a great way to, again, keep in touch with donors and steward that. You'll also want to think about appeal authors. So who's going to be the author of your content or appeal message? And it can be multiple. And you'll want to also segment donors based on preferences in their focus areas. So if you have different programs, you want to try to segment it based on what you might know of the donor, what they might prefer to see and read about. And you'll want to tailor the author based on that. If you have certain program leads, you want to make it come from them versus maybe the executive director. All right. And you'll also want to think about your follow-up, and you want to do it tactically. So this really needs to be structured just as well as the ask and appeal. In fact, you don't want to skimp on planning for the follow-up. You'll want to think about who you'll be sending your thank yous to, when they'll be sent, who's sending them, what methods you're using to send them. Is it going to be a phone call, an email, postcard, or a combination of all 3 or multiple? All right. And our second bullet here, best practices, is access to quality design and videography resources. So, we do recognize videography is expensive, but there is an alternative that we found has worked in the past. If you have really nice, vibrant photos, what you can do is do a storybook with the visuals. So for instance, just like a slideshow of 12 to 13 photos coming one after the other, and then you'll have a narrator talking over the visuals about the impact, and it'll still provide that storytelling element, and they'll see what difference the agency is making. And this can be really effective, especially if the narrator is really good, has a great speaking voice, has good charisma, cadence. And this is, again, really great for smaller organizations to save on resources until they're able to build up into potentially outsourcing some videography services. And I did provide also a link to an example of a series that Empower Me Academy did a while back, their leadership series. And the focus is on different elements of leadership and different EMA student in each one, which is really impactful and really well done. So you can take a look at that link after this session. The presentation deck will also be provided. All right. And our third bullet point here is database management. So again, you're going to be managing large sets of data. And so whether it's you're utilizing a platform like Razor's Edge, Salesforce, Bloomerang, Donor Perfect, or even just using spreadsheets, you want to make sure that you have a data management platform or system and you're using it well, and you have the resources to continue to use it consistently. So in terms of major gifts, you want to definitely segment your donor lists to tailor appeals and communications. And you want to segment out any major gifts out of the mass appeals. So you're not targeting those major donors in those mass appeals and potentially losing out on a larger donation if you would have contacted them more directly and targeted. So again, you want to just make sure that you're including that 90% group, donor group in those mass appeals. All right, and another item here is you want to think about also integrating across your social media platforms, different platforms with your CRM, where that makes sense. And this integration can occur down the line, you know, when your donations start coming in, to the extent that you can't log them manually, which is always a very nice problem to have, but something that you can think about too down the line. Most donor data management platforms have those integrative services. And the last data point here, you'll also need leadership. So these are going to be people who are doing the work. It can be staff or volunteer leadership, but regardless, you really need to make sure that you have people power to execute consistently, and that you have the internal resources to make sure that you're communicating through marketing and major gift outreach and annual giving outreach. And if you have a larger office as well, you want to really also make sure that you have a clear understanding of delegation. Make sure that you're not crossing paths with each other or failing to do something because you thought someone else was going to be doing it. So with those larger agencies, sometimes you just really want to make sure that you are delegating effectively. All right. And on to one of our last slides here. Just wanted to go over some key takeaways to recap some of our main points throughout the presentation. So first point, you'll want to make sure that you're optimizing the balance of major gifts work and annual and membership giving based on your internal capacity to execute. So for instance, have a note here, university versus startup. A university is going to have much different tactics than a startup, for instance. But the tools that they use and solutions are going to be available for each, and they're going to be similar. So again, you'll want to be using data management and make sure that you're tracking your donors effectively. I want to reiterate too that you want to view annual giving as an entry point into longer term relationship building and within your development strategy. So again, that harkens back to the Stanford example and are saying again that the work starts once the gift comes in. You know, so gifts comes in, and then you need to tactically, you know, need to determine what moves to make to effectively steward the gift. And last point here, start small. So remember the 1977 hypothetical example. You want to make sure you do it right and grow incrementally over time. And remember that data management is key here. So make sure you have a platform and the resources ready to go to track all activities and donations to manage all the work that we've discussed. All right, And with that, I want to open it up to a QA and yeah, just open it up to everyone. So feel free to drop any questions in the chat or raise your hand or just shout out some questions that you might have.
Hey, sorry. I jumped in a little late here, but was just curious, like what advice you have for those just getting started on trying to get crowdsourced donations.
Yes, that's a great question, and really depends on kind of where you're at. So feel free to reach out to me if you want a little more of an in-depth answer. But I would recommend starting definitely with first communications, which was our previous presentation. And that's really important to build on your network and really start your outreach from there. And then you can dive into this more intensive annual kind of membership giving. So you kind of want to make sure that you're building on our House of Developments. Again, reiterating myself, but the rooms really build on each other, and you want to make sure that you're kind of following that kind of consecutive sequence.
For sure. I missed that first presentation, but is there a recording of that one? I don't know.
There is. Yeah.
Yep. This is Lindsay here. I'll be getting that posted within the next 24 hours, and I'll send you all the link.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Looks like Melissa has a question in the chat.
Looks like Melissa. Can you talk about incentives and memberships? So just make sure I'm understanding the question accurately. Are you asking what incentives you can use to utilize memberships or kind of spur on memberships?
Yeah, but the organization I volunteer for has a lot of incentives, very handy. But I know that some orgs don't. Somebody can speak to sort of the benefits of incentives or incentives extracting or anything like that.
Yeah, again, this, I might say this a lot, but it really depends on your agency. So again, feel free to reach out to me if you'd like a more in-depth answer to that, but it'll depend. I think the incentives really need to be mission-centric, what you're doing in the community, and make sure that the incentives make sense for what you're providing. You don't want to just offer kind of random membership incentives that don't really align with your mission or your organization's goals. Unfortunately, I can't give you too much more, but feel free to reach out to me too for some more information specific to your agency. It'll be a little bit, again, dependent on the mission and goals. Excellent. Any other questions from anyone? All right. Well, again, feel free to reach out to me if anyone has any other follow-up questions or, oh, it's a lot of information, but I appreciate that. Exactly. It's a little bit of a data dump, I know, but yeah, take some time to sit with it. And if you think of any questions, just feel free to shoot me an email. I'm always available and always happy to answer any question I'm able. So, but yeah, thank you everyone so much for listening, and I'll pass it back to Lindsay to kind of round us off with this.
Great. Thank you so much, Chelsea. And thank you all for joining us. So we'll get this and the previous session posted online shortly, and then I'll go ahead and send those links out to everyone who's registered for either session. And we hope to see you all next Tuesday at 4 o'clock for the third session on fundraising events. Have a great evening.